Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Noe de la Sancha, and we are going to talk about something called the sixth mass extinction on planet Earth. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. I really do appreciate the invite.
So these six mass extinctions, we're in the last one, which we're going to talk about, and which your research is invested in.
Correct.
But some of these other mass extinctions, there's a theory about a meteor hitting in Mexico, right?
Correct.
That is the previous one. Is that the fifth one?
That is the fifth mass extinction, correct.
And tell us a little bit about that.
So as far as we can tell, the fifth mass extinction had to do with this massive meteorite that hit what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico.
Yeah.
And the subsequent impact led to the extinction of something like 70% of all living terrestrial vertebrates, for example. Also many other aquatic organisms. The important part about this is that led to the extinction of the large Jurassic Park type dinosaurs, right?
Yeah.
Things like T-Rex and all their relatives.
Yeah.
And that was helpful because at that point in time, mammals, which is what we are, right?
Yeah.
We're just tiny little organisms like this. Every time there's a mass extinction, basically it's like the planet becomes empty, and that allows for evolution to sort of spark up and to speed up.
Right.
And that has many scientists would suggest, has allowed for the diversification of mammals as we know them today.
Prior to that, is there a flood?
Is there a flood? That's a great question. Depends who you ask, right? However, one of the things to keep in mind is that as the planet is warmer, there is plenty of evidence that many places did become submerged underwater.
Yeah.
So if you think about it that way, there definitely has been places that definitely went underwater.
But most of these are all climate related, right? It's the melting
Correct.
and the
Correct.
reformation of the polar ice caps.
Yeah, and well, also that meteorite that hit.
And the one little meteorite.
Yeah, 1 meter.
Yeah. You also mentioned just a side question here, but you also mentioned it also eliminated a lot of species in the ocean.
Yep.
How were they affected?
That's a great question. If you think about it, anytime there's a mass extinction, that has reverberations in every aspect, right?
Yeah.
When you think about, for example, the third mass extinction,
Yeah.
which is believed to be the most intense mass extinction, and that one was driven by climate change. As far as we can tell, there's plenty of evidence from the fossil record that there's these massive chains of volcanoes around what is now Siberia.
Okay.
That were spewing all kinds of what are called global gases, very similar to carbon dioxide and methane that we have
So this
now.
was similar to the fifth extinction then. It was a matter of
the thing about that,
light being filtered out, right?
correct. Well, the thing about the third mass extinction, that was caused by natural geologic
Right, of course.
changes in our planet. The other
Yeah.
one was from an external
Yeah.
source.
But a
which is
similar
meteorite.
effect.
Sure. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yes. Yes.
So your research
Correct.
relates to this. And as I understand this, a lot of what we know is based on the fossil record, right?
Right.
But you're doing something that's parallel to that. You're looking at the living record and deciding what that tells us about what's going on right now. Tell me about that.
Okay, so what I currently work on is understanding the impacts of humans on biodiversity that we have today.
Right.
Now, what we're looking at is what's called the Anthropocene, which is a current mass extinction. So basically, we're in the middle of another extinction, very similar to when that meteorite came and wiped out all the large dinosaurs. And instead of it being a driver, it being a meteorite, we have one species that's primarily driving this new mass extinction, and that's Homo sapiens. Right. And as part of this, we've seen evidence that as humans left Africa, the continent of Africa, and people started migrating to the Middle East, into Asia, into Europe, we started seeing mass extinctions at that point of megafauna.
So this term not only refers to the period in which humans started to dominate the landscape, but it also refers to the beginning of the extinction immediately.
Exactly, yes.
So what kinds of things were being eliminated early on here?
That's a great question. So it depends where you ended up. In places like Asia, there's lots of large mammals that started to go extinct. It's interesting when people arrived.
Mastodons, things like that?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's especially true in North America. And that's
Okay.
later on when humans got into the North American continent.
Okay.
It's interesting when humans arrived in Australia, there were many like large giant kangaroos and other marsupials that went extinct. When humans entered
Wait. Giant kangaroos?
Yes.
Like
yeah.
how big is a giant kangaroo?
Probably, I don't know, 9 feet or so. Like they were large.
Okay.
They were large. I don't know exactly their height, but they were larger than the ones that we have now.
We
And the
probably
ones-
eliminated them out of necessity.
Well, that's a great question, right? So that's a great point. So when humans arrived, for example, in North America, it's believed that humans, if not were the main driver, they were one of the main causes or one of the many things that kind of drove things like mastodons and mammoths to extinction in North America, potentially things like saber-toothed tigers. And so part of that is because...
Why them?
That's a great question. There's probably a lot of, so there's probably many reasons. But for example, one of the things is that humans potentially are really good hunters. And there's several quarries or places where you find like lots of large deposits of things like of bones, of mammoths and stuff like that. And many people suggest that maybe humans would bring these massive herds of mastodons and then tip them over the edge of a cliff, for example. And so one of the things to keep in mind, especially that many of these large mammals, take a really long time to regenerate, right? We see that with things like elephants.
So they were more vulnerable.
They're definitely more vulnerable, yes, 100%.
Interesting.
Now,
Yes.
the follow-up part of this now is that especially once we started getting into the industrial era worldwide, we started to do a lot more clear cutting of vegetation and changing natural vegetation.
Yeah.
Now this has been going on for a long time. There's plenty of evidence, like in the Americas, that Native Americans have been altering their habitats for quite a long time, right? However, especially after the Industrial Revolution, we started to speed up that considerably. As we started losing many of the large mammals, like North America, we don't have as many bison as we used to have at one point in time, right?
Right.
You look at Chicago, when was the last time that you saw, for example, a black bear or wolves for that matter?
I've
right?
yet to see a black bear in Chicago. Yeah.
Right, and so at one point they're fairly predominant in this region, right?
Yeah.
And we've been losing, first of all, the megafauna. The part that starts to get a little bit scarier now is that now, because of all the altering of, especially of habitat throughout the world, we're starting to see the impact in middle-sized animals, and even more so in small mammals, which is primarily what I work on, and primarily small mammals.
Okay, so you're looking at changes that are happening right now to small mammals.
Correct.
As a way of helping to document and track this extinction that's going on.
Exactly.
So tell us a little bit about your research. What would we see you doing if we found you in the field?
My research primarily, historically, I've been working on what is known as the Atlantic forest of South America. The Atlantic forest goes from around northeastern Brazil, along the coast of Brazil, into northeastern Argentina and into eastern Paraguay.
Okay.
Most of my research focuses in the subtropical forest of eastern Paraguay. And one of the things that we've seen there is that nowadays we only have somewhere around 20 to maybe 12%, depending on what study you cite, of the original forest left. And this is the second most biodiverse forest system after the Amazon. This is also an extremely important forest system because it has large levels of what's called endemism. That means that it has areas where you have species that are found nowhere else except here in this type of forest. And so as part of that, as we start losing that habitat, that is one of the primary reasons why we lose species, right? It starts off with large mammals, things like jaguars or tapirs, maybe some primates. But now it's starting to affect really small native species of like rodents, for example. Mm-hmm. So what I do and what I've been doing is we've been working on small, different sized forest patches in eastern Paraguay. And we've been documenting the diversity of rodents and marsupials that are found in those forest remnants.
And also documenting changes that you're seeing, right?
Exactly, correct. And so one of the things that you see is that you start seeing more of what's called fragmentation. That is when you have, let's say this was all continuous forest, you start making roads, clear cutting areas, you start ending up with smaller forest remnants. They obviously can't support as much life as this whole continuous forest. And that's what we're seeing now, and now we're even starting to see it in small mammals, things like rodents and marsupials and potentially bats.
So have you thought about where this goes? Have you projected this out in some way? I mean, will this resolve itself in some way? All these other mass extinctions resolve themselves to some extent, right? How do we end up? Where do you think this goes for us?
Oh, it doesn't look great. It doesn't look great. So
well,
this is part of what we want to study, right? And part of this is that as we start losing more and more biodiversity, you not only start losing species necessarily, but you start to lose functions of those forests and those ecosystems, right? We take a lot of ecosystem functions for granted, right? Everything from filtering water, controlling local climates, things like the entire precipitation and hydrologic cycle in an immediate area, in a local area. And this is the part that's scary, right? So one of the things that this last December, I had the opportunity to go back to Paraguay, and I was able to see some of my colleagues that I hadn't seen in a long time. And they were describing that in Asunción, which is the capital of Paraguay, they've been having some of the longest droughts that they've had, and some of them said that they've experienced in their entire lives. Now, this is a subtropical region where you have tropical rainforests, where usually it would rain on a daily basis. Some of these areas, some of the forest reserves that we were working on, hadn't seen rain in months. So
you're obviously saying then that there's a relationship between what happens in the animal population and the weather.
100%. It's all related.
Connect those dots for me.
Okay. So when you think about this, right, a tropical rainforest is all connected in the sense that, first of all, you have certain soil that supports different types of vegetation, right?
Okay.
Tropical rainforests, especially on our planet, that's where you have the highest diversity of plants, right? As part of that, that creates a very specific microclimate. If you ever go to a tropical rainforest, right, and you go in there, you walk in and it feels cool, like physically cool. It doesn't feel hot.
Oh, really?
Yes, it's warm, but for us, but it's not hot. When it starts to get warmer, it's when you start having more gaps, and it makes sense. If you have a if you have a forest where the canopy is completely closed, you have lots of shade. With all that shade, you maintain a lot of that moisture, and you maintain a lot of that local humidity, right? Now, as part of that, every morning or every evening, right, as it gets cooler, a lot of that usually would that moisture would start to rise, and eventually that becomes precipitation. That precipitation literally usually falls right there, and it keeps this cycle going, right? As you start having more clear cutting, in Paraguay, one of the main reasons why we have the clear cutting is for the production of soy. Now, a lot of the soy then is harvested and then is shipped off to primarily places, as I understand it, places like China, that's primarily used for feed, of things like of pigs primarily, right? And so one of the things to consider is that as we have this scenario, once you clear cut that forest, those soils, especially tropical soils, are not particularly fertile. They're actually very infertile, and they're actually very shallow. So once you clear cut that forest, you basically take up all the biomass, and you take off that whole ecosystem with you, basically. So that's one of the things to consider. Much of the recycling of nutrients in a rainforest happens almost immediately. As you have all this biomass that's coming down, everything starts to decompose, and almost immediately it gets absorbed by everything. Now, animals, all sorts of animals, right, play a role. Various species have different types of roles. When you think about things like bats in tropical rainforests, they're the ones that are primarily reseeding a lot of that forest. And it actually, if you look at tropical rainforests, that have huge diversity of bats. One of the things to consider, for example, is that rodents, right, make up approximately 40% of all mammals.
Is that right? And bats, of course, are rodents.
No,
they're not.
Bats are their own thing.
They are.
And
they're
bats,
complete their own category.
Yes, and bats.
They look like mice with wings to me.
They could. But no, they're totally different. They're actually more closely related to us than they are to rodents, as a matter of fact.
No kidding.
Yes. And if you think about it, so bats make up at least 30% of all mammals. So between rats and bats, that's 70% of all mammal biodiversity.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, and I'm talking about species. I'm not talking about numbers of individuals.
There are people who probably don't want to know that. I should have given them a warning at the beginning of the show.
Well, the important thing is that they're extremely important, and they're extremely important to many ecosystems. And actually, if you think about bats in particular, that's an easy one because especially bats like out here, right? many parts of North America, they're the ones that actually take out all the insects and all the pests around agricultural areas. Without those numbers skyrocket, you know?
I've heard that they're good for keeping the mosquito population at bay, even in the city, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. That's exactly why they're so important. For example, and that's just one species, right?
Yeah.
The thing about bats is that bats is not one thing, right?
Right.
And bats are extremely diverse in the sense that there's, for example, there's like insect-eating bats, there's nectar-feeding bats, there's fruit-eating bats, there's seed-eating bats. There's actually some bats that specialize only on fish. They actually have like these little things and they actually fish out fish from the water. And of course, there's at least 3 species of true vampire bats. And they only consume blood from other vertebrates.
No kidding.
Yeah.
But not people.
There's been some that do, there's been incidences of them basically nipping at people while they sleep.
Did the
different
people
parts
act
of the
strangely
Amazon.
after they were bit or anything?
No.
Okay,
You don't
okay.
transform after that.
Okay, all right. Well, so now look, mostly when this topic comes up, it's my impression that people talk about global warming and the mass extinction that might be going on here is something that we need to stop.
Yep.
Right? But I get the sense you're not looking at it like that. You seem to be looking at it as if this is happening and you're just tracking it, but you don't really expect that it's going to stop at any point, do you?
Well, that's a great question, and hopefully that's the point, right? And hopefully
Yeah.
the idea of this whole research is that we can come up with management and conservation tools that will allow us to minimize that loss of species on our planet, right? Because one of the things to consider, at the end of the day, our planet is going to be fine, you know? Our planet is going to survive. It's survived 4.5 billion years. It survived 5 major mass extinctions.
Right.
The question is,
That's the good news, folks. Now here's the bad news. Okay, go ahead.
the question is, are we going to survive that? Because as whether we want to or not, we're highly dependent on these other species and whatnot.
Right.
Now, here's another kicker, another one of those things that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're looking at right now is we're starting to look at zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases are diseases that get transmitted from animals to humans.
Okay.
Now, it turns out that somewhere around 40% of all diseases known to humans are zoonotic diseases. Those are diseases that we get from other species. Now, as part of that, one of the things that we're seeing, and there's lots of evidence of this happening now, and I would argue that even our current situation, COVID, was actually, there's plenty of evidence that it was transmitted from some other mammalian host, where it was the original host of that virus.
Yeah.
This is happening, I would argue, as we have more and more deforestation, for example, right? A few years ago, we had a study where we were able to see that small mammals, rodents and marsupials that are found in smaller forest remnants,
Yeah.
we were able to get some hair from them, and then we were able to measure some stress hormones in their hair. Those are long-term accumulations of stress hormones. We found that small mammals in smaller forest patches are more stressed out than those in bigger forest patches, which leads us to believe that there's an association with deforestation and animals being more stressed out. If you're more stressed out, there's plenty of evidence that organisms become more immunosuppressed and they're more likely to get more infections. As you start getting more infections, you're more likely to get infections or pass on viruses from other species. Now, this is one of the things that we're probably causing the perfect storm for more and more diseases as we have more and more deforestation. So even if we want to look at it from a very selfish perspective,
Yeah.
it is in our best interest to maintain those wild populations as healthy as we can. Because, for example, as we have more and more deforestation, humans are becoming in contact with animals that they've never really had interactions with in the past. And we've seen this with many, many ailments, everything from, for example, many of the mosquito-borne diseases, things like AIDS, for example. It'd be arguably many of the avian flu and swine flu, for example.
So let's go back to what we started talking about here then, right? So we've got this history of these mass extinctions, and we're in number 6 right now. The other 5 resolved themselves, right? Because they played out.
Sure.
right? If this one plays out, we're gone,
Potentially.
right? So
It's not out of the realm of possibility.
yeah. So then the question is, is it possible to stem the tide on something like this, or is there a kind of planetary inevitability about it?
That's a great question, right? And that's an easy argument so that we don't feel responsible to do anything, right?
Well, I wasn't trying to
No,
defend
not you.
the corporations here.
And it's going to be going to be tough, right? It's going to be
Yeah.
hard. We've sort of dug ourselves into a hole, and we're going to have to work really hard to dig ourselves out of a hole. Now, one of the things to consider, and I always talk to my students about this, right? You may know about this, well, I'm sure you know about this, but back when I was young, right, when I was in college and whatnot, we go to so many bars that were always filled with smoke, right?
Yeah.
From everybody was smoking right and left.
Right.
And we used to go into restaurants where they had a non-smoking and a smoking section, right?
Which was ridiculous because the smoke traveled through the air.
Right. But then there was also like airplanes that you would go into and you could smoke in the airplane, right?
Right.
And now, when was the last time you went to a restaurant where there was a smoking and non-smoking section?
Well, I teach in Indiana, so they either have smoking or they don't, right?
Got
Yeah.
it. And so
Yeah.
my point is that change can happen really quick. And it's not impossible for mass changes, societal changes, that will require us to change what we prioritize to happen. And they can happen relatively quickly if we have the incentive to do so.
The problem is, of course, it's not profitable.
It can be, though. And it all depends on how we start looking at profit, right?
Yeah.
And if you start thinking about it, there's plenty of potential, and that's maybe where we need to be more, what would you call it, creative, right?
Yeah.
And start coming up with economies and products that are going to be a little bit more green and are going to be more helpful to improve our lives.
Yeah. Well, it's good to know that you're hopeful. I really intended to get a little bit more into your research. Can you? There's I think a shaggy mouse.
Yes.
That you were looking at.
Yeah.
Could you just give us some of the details of what actually you do when you're out in the field and when you get back into the lab and what you're studying.
That's a great question.
Okay.
Okay. So that paper that we just published was with a collaboration with colleagues in South America. And as part of that, we were looking at the shape variation of this little small rodent in South America. One of the things, when you do this type of research, you go out into the middle of nowhere, you put a bunch of traps, and you spend, 8 to 15 days out in the middle of the field. You're collecting small mammals. With the research that we're doing, we usually end up collecting many of those specimens, and then they get deposited in a place like the Field Museum here in Chicago. As part of that, then we couple that with various types of DNA analyses, many of which we do in the Field Museum.
Like you mentioned earlier, analyzing the hair so you can see what
Correct.
kind of things they've
Yeah,
gone through.
that's one different type of analysis that's done. Then we do other DNA analyses. And as part of that, we're able to better understand what species they belong to. And one of the things to keep in mind, and this is another thing to consider, is that right now we still don't know how many species of rodents we have, for example. We don't know how many species of bats we have on our planet, right? Many species of small mammals, all we know about them is from a handful of specimens in some natural history museum like the Field Museum, and that's all we know. So we still have a lot of exploration to do, and that's just with mammals.
Yeah.
It's even gets multiplied with birds, with fish, and with insects. It's estimated that we only know about 1 million of a potential 30 million species that are out there.
And if someone is interested in this and they go to the Field Museum, are there exhibits there that
Yes.
will
There's the Evolving Planet is a really good summary of everything we've been talking about, which is an excellent exhibit. I would highly urge people to go check that out. That's
good. And what kind of classes do you teach at Paul?
At DePaul, I'm teaching, it's called Applied Ecology. That's basically a ecology course that deals with the study of ecology and applying that. And then I also do various biostatistic classes where we do biostats. And then
Which is what?
Basically the application of statistical models and inference to understand biological systems.
To give me an example. What kind of insights do we get from that?
So it's to understand how patterns of biodiversity vary throughout tropical to temperate regions on our planet, for example.
Okay. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Noé de la Sancha for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.